While NATO pounds targets in Libya, Syria is hit only with sanctions. Why? What's the difference between government crackdowns which both target their own people? Two countries, two conflicts, two very different international reactions. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Libya, Syria, what's the difference? Both regimes have faced uprisings from their people, both of which have been put down violently in heavy-handed crackdowns. And yet the international community has intervened militarily in Libya and not in Syria. So a very simple but very important question today on Inside Story is, why? Let's get the facts first. A chronological look at the two countries' uprising. First, Libya. The uprising against Muammar Gaddafi began February 17. And as soon as that started, he faced a very strong reaction from the United Nations, the United States and the West in general. It took 9 days for the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on Gaddafi. That was February 26. 2 days later, the EU approved a similar package of sanctions, including an arms embargo. Then the rhetoric kicked up. US President Barack Obama said Gaddafi had lost his legitimacy to lead. On March 12, the Arab League called for a UN no-fly zone over Libya. That only took 5 days to be approved, the UN Security Council authorising a no-fly zone with all necessary measures to protect civilians. And not long after, March 19, NATO, under US command, carried out its first airstrike on Libya. So there you go. The grand scheme of things, you could say it was a pretty rapid move, just over a month from the start of the uprising to the first missile fired. The situation in Syria, though, seems to be different, certainly in terms of the US and Western reaction towards Assad's crackdown. Let's look at Syria. That uprising began March 15 with a small protest in Damascus calling for reform. 12 days later, March 27, the situation dramatically turned when security forces killed around 100 protesters in the southern city of Daraa, which is now really the hub of the protests. Since then, the Syrian regime has sent the army to the city, and recent reports talk about some 500 killings so far. But in this case, the UN, the US, the Western countries and even Turkey have been far more muted, asking only for Bashar al-Assad not to use excessive force on demonstrators. So we go back to our central question, don't we? What's the difference? And joining us to discuss this are our three guests. In Amman is Muin Rabani, an independent Middle East analyst and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. In Washington, D.C. is Richard Weitz, a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. And rounding out our panel in Ankara is Yusuf Kanli, a columnist at the Hurriyet Daily News, a Turkish newspaper. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Lovely to have you with us. Let's start in Ankara with Yusuf Kanli, because I've got an article of yours here entitled Syria Is Not Libya. Not to state the obvious, but why is Syria not Libya? What is the difference in your opinion?
First of all, Syria is bigger than Syria, as I call it, because of its role in the entire region. Syria is, for us, for Turkey, one of the countries that we have common security interests because of the Kurdish population and the general military balance in the area. Syria for Iran is the key Arab ally in the region. Syria for Saudis is the buffer zone with, regarding Shia Iran. Syria for the Gulf Arabs is also the same situation. In general framework, Syria is the, in quotes, troublemaker or peacemaker of the Arab world in any conflict. Whereas Libya is on the fringe, is small, rhetorically is important, but in reality doesn't play a very crucial role at all in the Middle East balance. Syria, for Israel, is an existential issue.
Okay, so you've described... No,
Syria is definitely not Libya.
Okay, so you've described two very different countries. Let me go to Muin Rabani to bring him into the conversation, get some thoughts. Yusuf Kanli, as I said, describing two very different countries and more about the influence they have. I wonder what your thoughts are about the personalities. Do they play a difference, the like of Muammar Gaddafi versus Bashar al-Assad?
Well, if the question is why is the West intervening in Libya and not in Syria, I think first we need to look at the reasons behind Western intervention. And I think it's quite clearly the case that in Libya, the West intervened essentially to put itself in the position of managing regime transition in Libya. Syria is a very long way off from anywhere near that. And even then, I think, you know, it's questionable whether the West would want to intervene directly into the Syrian situation. These are just, you know, we're very far from the point in Syria where one can kind of see the same kind of situation developing as we had in Libya a month ago.
Is Bashar al-Assad and his government, his regime, someone or something that the West can possibly engage with more? I mean, the US was looking to sort of closer ties with Syria not that long ago. Is that in the back of their minds, perhaps?
Well, I think the fundamental Western interest in all these situations is basically stability. And it was when that stability was completely rent asunder in Libya that the West chose to intervene. I mean, similar case can be made, I think, for Bahrain, which, you know, if you want to ask why in one and not in the other, I think you'd do much better to compare Libya with Bahrain than with Syria. Because in Bahrain, there was also, you know, an active support for a foreign intervention into the country, basically to crush the uprising and put the people back in their place. Now, if you look at Syria, it's still quite far from the point where you could make an argument that, you know, while the uprising may well have passed the point of no return, we're still, I think, quite far from the point where you would be able to say that the stability of the state is at stake.
Richard Weitz, let's bring you in for a quick thought as well. Muin Rabbani giving his thoughts there on why these are different situations, and also bringing in another country like Bahrain. You could include Yemen, you could include all these other places where intervention hasn't happened. What is different?
Well, I think it's useful to look at this from two perspectives for each country. Each country has certain goals and objectives they wish to achieve, a combination of security, economic, and humanitarian goals. And these tend, ideally they'd be consistent, but then you start applying particular cases, the balance falls out a bit differently for each of them. So I think your previous commentators gave good reasons why Syria would be classified very differently, and if you put in Russia and China and other countries as well, Syria probably is more important. Then there's also the perspective of means. What tools do governments have available? And here, Libya was just a fairly easy intervention. It's a weak government. It was already pretty divided. It has a very weak military. Didn't really have any close allies. Whereas Syria, it's a much harder case. There's no clear way you would intervene militarily. There's one obvious solution, but you can't use it. So it's you make a series of declarations, and you can't even have Security Council sanctions for the most part because of the Russia-China blockage. Right.
So what we're getting here, the feeling I'm getting here, is that Syria has got a whole lot more layers and a whole lot more influence in the region, which is why it's more delicate. Let me just, and for the viewers as well, show you what the US's official stance on this was like, if you like. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, who made it clear the situations in both countries are incomparable and that Washington is looking into other possible policies in Syria. This is what he said, quote, "Libya was a unique situation. We had large portions of the country that were out of the control of Muammar Gaddafi, and we had an international consensus to act. We had the support of the Arab League to act in a multilateral fashion. But Washington is pursuing a range of possible policy options in Syria. The administration is looking at targeted sanctions and to make clear that this behaviour is unacceptable." Now, the point about sanctions, we'll come back to that in a moment because I think that's a whole other issue. But the first point was the first words that he said there, Jay Carney. He said Libya was a unique situation. Yusuf Khanli in Ankara, the people in Syria, I'm sure, would say their situation is just as unique because it's happening to them, and to them I bet it doesn't feel a lot different to what's happening to the people in Libya.
First of all, I mean, don't forget that the Libya operation was done with the consent or with China and Russia nodding by abstaining to the resolution on Libya. Whereas even an unofficial session on Syria couldn't produce a press statement because of Russian and Chinese opposition. Why? As my friends have already said, there is a China-Russia background of the Syrian crisis. Sanctions probably will not be able to be, cannot be implemented there. Besides, as I mentioned earlier, for Israel, Syria controlling Hamas and Hezbollah will pose an incredible security risk the moment Syria loses its firm control over those groups.
So because of the China-Russia situation,
will bring the entire problem.
Because of the China-Russia situation, it's
Pardon?
almost not even worth going down the track. I mean, they've tried to get to the Security Council, and as you said, couldn't even get a
Definitely.
statement.
They couldn't get a statement. I mean, and from the Turkish point of perspective, Syria troubled would mean increased Kurdish problems. Turkey already has a very serious situation. Therefore, there would be a very important spillover effect on Turkey, and perhaps the next country that will boil over because of Syria will be Turkey. We already have a civilian disobedience campaign in southeastern Turkey among the Kurdish population. It will be very difficult for Turkey to handle the situation. And don't forget, we have waived visa with Syria already. Therefore, over the past few days, some 250 people already crossed through the borders illegally into Turkey. And in Turkish public opinion, there is a very strong movement not to extradite these people back because they would be hanged in Syria.
Okay,
This problem is really multi-layered.
It is multi-layered, definitely. Let's pick up on the idea of sanctions, which you mentioned there, the fact that we couldn't even get a statement on that. Muin Rabbani, the US then says, well, we'll look at sanctions, we'll look at targeted sanctions. It's just hard to see sanctions really working in this situation. What do you think?
Well, I think that Syria is already under all kinds of American and Western sanctions, so I question to what extent further sanctions are even possible. I would just like to make a point. I mean, since we are talking about Western intervention, I think it's vitally important to point out that, to the best of my knowledge, there are no Syrians of note that are actually advocating Western intervention in their country. Certainly not advocating regime change engineered by Washington, Paris, and London. Second of all, I think it's also important to see the extent to which Libya may have affected any possible scenario in Syria. My sense is that when the intervention began in Libya, there was a kind of feeling in Western capitals that, you know, you would have a few air sorties over Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli and maybe drop a bomb or two, and then somehow his regime would implode, and 24 hours later the Transitional National Council would assume power in Libya. It's obviously turned out to be a bit more complicated than that, and I think that has also affected any thinking, potential thinking, I don't even think it's on the boards yet, regarding Syria. And certainly I think that, you know, if and when these discussions take place, you will see, for example, militaries telling their politicians, you know, you've made a complete mess of Libya without having clear objectives and so on. And you could see political leaders getting quite a bit of resistance from senior military officers about wanting to avoid a repeat of the Libyan scenario. But again, you know, the two key points are the Syrians basically, you know, across the political spectrum, reject any Western intervention in their country, and it doesn't seem to be on the cards in order to have such a discussion now.
No, it's a great point that Muin Rabbani makes about the fact that if we are talking about Western intervention, that it hasn't necessarily worked so far in Libya. Let me talk to Richard Weitz now. If intervention on that level hasn't worked, arguably, and sanctions, again, as Muin Rabbani was saying, Syria's already been under sanctions, so what effect would they have? Is there another option? Is there, God forbid, dialogue, you know, a mediator or a diplomat or a go-between or some way trying to talk to the Syrian people? the Syrian regime, I should say.
That appears to be one of the two pillars of the current U.S. administration's strategy. The one is the sanctions. Now remember, sanctions have many purposes. One of them, which is actually to influence the targeted government, but they serve all sorts of other purposes too. They satisfy domestic and foreign constituencies. They signal other governments not to behave that way, and so on. So you might even see more sanctions, even though they'll have no effect. You often see this with Iran and North Korea, for example. In terms of, but aside from the sanctions, there is this declaratory warnings, but there is some kind of dialogue going on. That's probably why they're reluctant to pull the ambassador out. There have been calls in the United States to have the ambassador recalled. We recently actually sent an ambassador back to Syria after many years' absence. And you could see why you do that as symbolic protest, but then that deprives you as an important person who may be able to influence decision-making. And it's a question of what you think is going on within the Syrian government. I mean, is it a case where no matter what you do, they're not going to pay much attention to you? Or do you think that if you can get to the right people or the right factions play themselves out, then you will see a better improvement in policy? And my guess is they still think the latter is the case.
Gentlemen, let's pause again for a moment and look a bit more at the comparisons between the two cases, some of which we've already discussed, but I think it is worth recapping. Certainly civilian casualties were one of the main concerns of the world community, and in both countries disproportionate use of force has caused plenty of alarm. Again, as I say, let's compare. Both regimes put the blame on foreign conspiracies, but while the Libyan regime warned that forces would show no mercy with the rebels, the Syrians insist foreign infiltrators have killed both civilians as well as government security and military personnel. So there's one difference. The sort of blurry vision on the Syrian side perhaps slowed down the world response while the UN Security Council authorized its no-fly zone over Libya, taking, remember those words, all necessary measures to protect civilians. The same council, as we've been discussing, failed to agree on a statement condemning government violence in Syria. And regionally, Libya is more isolated. Yes, it is bordered by states that have undergone their own revolutions, but they don't necessarily support the Gaddafi regime. On the contrary, and we heard this from Yusuf Khanli, that Syria's proximity to Israel risks turning any outside intervention into some sort of new chapter of the regional conflict, which could involve maybe Lebanon, maybe Iran as well. So there's so many more issues to think about there, I guess. Yusuf Khanli, if I come back to you in Ankara, my question to all of that is, just because there's all those issues and layers and delicate layers to deal with, that doesn't mean nothing should be done. Now, sanctions, might be put in place. The US is looking at that, but really, it does seem like everyone's standing back and waiting for something to happen, waiting for some balance to tip.
Not on the contrary, rather than staying out and doing nothing, or taking a sanctions decision which will not be applicable on land. I think the wisest way is to go through diplomacy and diplomatic measures on Syria, such as those applied by Turkey, such as those applied by the United States so far. That is, engaging the Syrian administration and pushing as much pressure as possible to convince the Bashar Assad regime to continue the democratization process. Because the more reforms undertaken by Syria, the more the problem will become under control. That's the only way. Otherwise, we will have an incredible hot potato in our hands.
Sorry to interrupt you. You can't, and when I say you, I mean the Syrian regime, they can't talk about reform and making changes that way while still attacking people in Daraa. One cancels out the other.
Of course, that's a hypocrisy. That's a hypocrisy. While they are talking about reform, they are killing people at the same time. They are sending tanks on people. And for the leaders of Turkey, United States, and others who will be talking with Bashar Assad, they must point this out very clearly and tell Assad that he cannot fool the world.
There's one topic which we haven't really discussed yet, gentlemen, though I think Muin Rabbani may have brought it up at some point, and that's the idea of this intervention across the region. The fact is, America, the West, the international community, however you want to put it, can't intervene in every country, and there's a lot of unrest happening across the Middle East at the moment. Muin, let me ask you, does the region, or the world in fact, almost expect too much? I mean, when you get this much unrest across one region, how can you have the United States or the international community, NATO, however you want to put it, intervening all over the place?
Well, I think there's a more fundamental question, which is, should it intervene? Does it have any right to intervene? Does it have any legitimacy to intervene? I mean, I think, you know, the premise and the question that somehow NATO intervention in the Middle East is motivated by a commitment to promote the cause of human rights is just so patently absurd when measured against the historical record. You know, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance is not today waging a war on the shores of the southern Mediterranean in order to promote human rights or self-determination.
But then doesn't
secondly,
sorry, I want to pick up on the point while you've made it. Don't we get into the dangerous territory of not doing anything, or in you know, cases in the past where no one has intervened and it's turned into terrible situations?
I think Iraq is a perfect example that demonstrates beyond, you know, every reasonable and unreasonable doubt that having no Western intervention would have been vastly preferable to the scenario we had, where you know, the idea that I think Iraq also argues against, the idea that you can have somehow an expansion of human rights as kind of a byproduct of an intervention undertaken for very different interests. What you got basically is thousands of bodies turning up on the streets every month, you know, throughout the country. Now, so I think, you know, if there is going to be intervention, and the third point I would make is if there is going to be intervention, and of course, you know, you can never categorically exclude the possibility of circumstances emerging in which you would have to seriously consider such things, then there's also another question, which is who should be undertaking that intervention? You know, why should it be the United States? Why should it be NATO? Why should it be the West? You know, I think most people in this region believe that if the West was in any way committed to the human and national rights of Arabs, it wouldn't be bombing Libya, and we wouldn't be having these discussions about Syria. But, you know, how can a country that only so recently vetoed a Security Council resolution that did nothing more than confirm the illegality of Jewish settlement in occupied territory, how can such a government and such an alliance be taken seriously, or at least in terms of its claims to be promoting human rights and democracy and whatnot, when it seeks military intervention in this region? It's just an absurd contradiction. And again, I don't think the people of this region are morons and are going to fall for that kind of argument.
Richard Weitz in Washington, to intervene or not to intervene, is that the question, or is it, as Muammar Rabbani says, who should intervene? Who has the right? Why should they?
I think the model that everybody hopes to see is basically the fourth wave of democratization. You had the third wave in the 1990s when the Soviet bloc fell apart, and you had a bunch of countries go democratic, some more easily than others. Remember what happened in Romania, where you had, that's the situation similar to Libya, except a lot shorter. But then you ended up with China and Tiananmen, and the whole thing stopped. So you have to be careful when you set these things going. In terms of intervention, I agree basically what your previous commentator said. It's a question of, you've got a series of values, security, economic, and humanitarian. And in the case of Libya, humanitarian won out because there weren't strong security and economic interests. And so you didn't want to have Gaddafi massacre a bunch of people. And to their credit, the Chinese and Russians concurred in this. But for most of the other countries, the flow of interest is much more complex. And so even if the question, putting aside the question whether should, I don't think they would, just because the way they're going to start ordering their interests and values are such that they're at the most, they'll just press on the margins. And as pointed out previously, a lot of interventions can backfire. So I think that what we're going to see is Libya might be very much the exception as this process goes forward.
Gentlemen, what I would love to do is have this conversation with you all again in a month's time and actually see perhaps what has happened, or indeed what hasn't happened. We'll see if we can't do something like that. I want to thank you all, of course, Muammar Rabbani, who joined us from Amman in Jordan. Richard Weitz was in Washington, D.C., and Yusuf Khanli was in Ankara in Turkey. Gentlemen, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. You can send your comments and suggestions to us whenever you'd like to. InsideStory@aljazeera.net is our email address for comments on this show or indeed for a future show. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team here on Inside Story. Thanks for joining us.